I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Today I'll be talking with architecture critic Michael Kimmelman about his new book. But first, it's a new citywide push to remove people with severe untreated mental illness from New York City's streets and subways. This week, Mayor Eric Adams announced the plan directing police, emergency medical workers to take people off the streets if they deem them to be too mentally ill to care for themselves, even if they pose no threat to others. Sarah Maslin Nir has been covering this story for the New York Times. She's a Metro reporter. Sarah, this reminds me of the Dave Do Something headline in the Post about David Dinkins on crime. This is Eric Do Something. Everyone wants the mayor to do something about mentally ill, homeless people who seem threatening. What is new about what the mayor is doing? And if this is new, or if it's not new, why couldn't this have been done earlier?
Well, there are a couple questions to ask here. Is this the something that the city wants done about this problem of perhaps vagrant, mentally ill, homeless people? And is this going to be effective? And then you can ask a corollary, which is, are people who are not of harm to others, merely harming themselves, merely unwell, wandering the street, are they something we need to put away?
And what's the answer?
I think the answer is very mixed depending on who you speak to. And actually, the night this was announced, I went throughout the city with a team of other reporters interviewing homeless people themselves about how they felt, and they didn't have one answer.
The people you interviewed were sort of a self-selected group in that they answered rationally. We didn't interview, or probably couldn't interview, the people who were mentally ill enough not to answer rationally.
Well, I spoke to a woman by the name of Mika Brown.
And she had some very interesting things to say.
Yes, I said, how do you feel about perhaps your peers being subject to this protocol? And she said, it's not my peers, it's me. She said, I have schizophrenia and another psychotic disorder. I'm highly medicated right now. That's the only reason I can keep it together. And I would be vulnerable to this, and it makes me scared. But then she said something really fascinating. She said, on the other hand, I have been involuntarily committed by police when I've been in a spiral 3 times, and she credited her time spent in psych wards as why she was as well as she was at that moment.
But how about Ms. Brown, the fact that she keeps going out on the street? How is there a way to prevent that recidivism? Did she stop taking her medicine? Did she lack supervision? What was the problem that forced her back into involuntary treatment time after time?
Well, it's very challenging to have mental illness. These people are quite often very vulnerable. A large proportion of the city's homeless are mentally ill, according to the Coalition for the Homeless. So there's a real Venn diagram of vulnerability there. But, the other question, is it Ms. Brown's right to be on a public street in her state if she's not a harm to others? And that's the fundamental question of this new protocol. If you are involuntarily committing people because you envision they're a harm to themselves, who makes that judgment call? Is it the police? Is it the EMT who passes them by? Who's deciding here? It's certainly not the people who are going to fall victim to this themselves.
And isn't there already a waiting list for treatment for people like this? I mean, how is the city going to, however well-intentioned it is, going to accommodate these people?
Well, I think the real question is the waiting list for homeless shelters. The huge overpopulation of homeless people. I think the number is a vast undercount, 3,400 on the street at night, unsheltered. Does this new push treat that problem? I think the question is very much out.
Let me just read what the mayor said so we understand what we're talking about exactly. He said that people would be taken involuntarily when severe mental illness prevents them from meeting their own basic human needs to the extent they are a danger to themselves. The directive seeks to dispel a persistent myth that the legal standard for involuntary intervention requires an overt act demonstrating that the person is violent, suicidal, or engaging in outrageously dangerous behavior likely to result in imminent harm. So who determines this, and what does the law actually say if this is, as the mayor says, a persistent myth?
Well, I think you're going to have a lot of legal challenges from people who do get caught up in this dragnet. Right now, the police and EMTs and other people empowered to make these decisions are going to be going through training, the mayor says. What does that training look like? And are these people the most qualified to be these decision makers, to determine this very gray thing you just read? And the other thing we have to think about is a huge preponderance of New York City's homeless are people of color, Black people. And we know when police and Black people cross paths for the past several years, this has been the outcry, bad things happen. Do we want to subject this vulnerable population to potential violence, to potential danger? Do we want to continually have police and them cross paths? It might be a very dangerous mix.
Most people would say they don't belong on the street, but where do you put them? Where do they get treated? How do they get treated? How long do they remain in treatment? Are any of these questions, have they been addressed yet?
Not even slightly. This, rolled out on Tuesday, and these are the questions that the homeless people themselves that I interviewed are asking, but also people who interact with them. So my reporter colleagues and I went into bodegas and different facilities where throughout the night, perhaps homeless people will interact, sometimes dangerously. And we were very surprised that the people who are subject, people from more stable walks of life who are subject to these outbursts, perhaps, were very on the fence. They said, do we want this unsafe city? Do we want this feeling of tension in the street? But do we want these people to end up God knows where? No. And so I think it's a really complicated question, even for people who would rather them not be there.
How many of these people are out on the street because they think the streets are even safer than homeless shelters?
That's a number we can't get to, but that is certainly an impression I get, that people don't want to be in homeless shelters for a variety of reasons. They can be robbed, they can be assaulted, they can be split up from their partners and families. One man said he chose the streets because he wanted to stay with his girlfriend. And there are many reasons people are on the streets. There are many reasons people are mentally ill. I'm not sure the mayor's policy, as it's currently laid out, addresses any of those.
What are other cities doing? Are there any other cities that are a model that we could emulate? You've written about Houston, I think, and other places. Are they doing any better than we are?
Look, I don't think any city gets this right. Homelessness, the intersection of mental illness is an intractable problem. California has an incredibly different policy than we do, a much more live and let live policy, and it's seen, a tremendous explosion in homeless encampments there, filled with people who are substance abusers and also mentally ill, problems that are intersectional and need to be addressed, and they're not being. So I'm not sure any city has figured it out yet.
Some psychiatrists, psychologists say that if you allow them to stay on the street, you're sort of allowing the sick to rot with their rights on, is the expression they use. So how do you reconcile that? How do you say, okay, you're entitled to stay on the street, it's public space, but you're not getting any help, you're not getting cured, you're not getting the medication you need. Society at large might be suffering as well as you individually.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is the $64 billion question, right? There is a tension between individual rights, the rights of the rest of the public, and also the health and safety of the person who is suffering themselves. It's thorny.
I guess it sure is. So I'm sure you'll be following this story some more because it will be unfolding and likely winding up in court as well. Thanks to Sarah Maslin Nir of the New York Times. Coming up next, we'll be taking a look at a new book by Michael Kimmelman that documented the city during the pandemic through his walking tours that appeared in the New York Times. Welcome back to New York Times Close Up. During the pandemic, New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman toured much of the city on foot. He started inviting others to join him, and he writes about the experience with architects, historians, other experts in his new book called The Intimate City: Walking New York. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful read, a great holiday gift. Michael, you said the purpose of this book was not atonement, but attunement. What did you mean by that?
I think there's a way in which we only really relate to our surroundings, in fact, appreciate the city, see it when we're walking. You know, so much of life in the city is on subways, getting to and from one place. Taking a walk is a different thing, without a particular destination in mind. And the COVID pandemic was, terrifying in many ways, but it was also a really interesting moment when it was as if the city was on pause, and it was possible to see it as if time had stopped. And I think, it opened my eyes to a lot of things I'd never looked at in the city before. And I think it also was a reminder of how much the city is a rock, a kind of, it has a longevity. We were panicked about what was happening every day, and the sense was that the city would endure, which is what I still believe.
What had surprised you in your walking tours? You went all over the city except Staten Island. What did you see that was different? And of course, every time you walk in the city, any of us do, it changes every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point, Sam, that there's always something else to see. And of course, I had the privilege of doing this with people who, I'd asked a bunch of people right when the pandemic started, and then Governor Cuomo had declared a lockdown, to take a walk with me, someplace meaningful to them. So first of all, I was walking with people on routes that meant something to them. So I was learning something about them.
And a wonderful selection of people, too.
Yeah, thank you. They are really terrific and very diverse, and that was also important, too. I wanted a diversity of places, a diversity of people and voices to express the way the city itself is made up of such a complicated and wonderful tapestry of different kinds of people, and also how physically the city has been built by people of all sorts. That's not, just architects. It's also engineers, but it's also people involved in law and government. It's community organizers. It's people who just, historians and all sorts of people who've lived here, essentially millions of people. We all make the city. And I was hoping on some level to at least hint at that in the book, too.
One of the things you point out in the book is that architecture is not just about how buildings look, but how they're used. Since the pandemic, obviously, one of the ways they're not used, not as much, is office space. What's going to happen to all that office space?
Yeah, I will say that in those early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure on people like me to prognosticate. And I didn't know what was happening hour to hour, much less was going to happen to the city, in the future. And there was a lot of leaning into the gloom and doom. So part of the project of the book was also to step outside that time scale and look at the city in a sort of longitudinally, and to understand how it's been made up of all sorts of ups and downs, and you can read those pentimenti in the city. And I think that's assuring, too. So it was not just about attunement, I think it was also on some level about consolation and joy. And I say that because I don't really know what's going to happen to offices. I think we've seen a dramatic change in the last few months. And I don't think we're going to go back to the 5-day-a-week office schedule for many people. But the city is made up of many different economies. And there had already been, before the pandemic, a desire to get out of what you might call the sort of mid-century idea of office life, in which you'd go to office parks, or there was a desire to have a much more complex sort of neighborhood, work-live areas. And I think the pandemic hastened and complicated that process. It's quite possible that we will return to something approaching normal in 2 or 3 years. But I think from the day-to-day perspective, already the city seems to be much more alive and much more normal than it used to be. And that might itself tamp down some of the gloom and doom, which we've all been leaning into, I think, out of fear, and also because there was something so shocking about seeing the city so suddenly emptied out.
Yeah, as you point out, after 9/11, people thought we would never build a skyscraper. And in the past, certainly 20 years, there's been, you could argue, a glut.
The biggest skyscraper boom ever. I mean, that's a very good example that there was this sudden cataclysm, and there was, an economic decline, and people were leaving the city, and there were all sorts of predictions about the end of the city. And what happened was the city returned much quicker than people had expected, and became much stronger and economically much richer. And then there was another economic collapse in 2008, and then the city picked up again. And so there is a certain kind of normalcy. After the epidemic a century ago, New York was going through one of its richest and most extravagant periods. So I don't think we really know. I do think what the pandemic did, though, which was really interesting, was to show us that the city is not just resilient, but sort of very organic. I mean, if you think about the fact that overnight 10,000 parking spaces were eliminated, usually the debate over a parking space in New York is like the Battle of the Somme. It's an incredible, struggle to try to even eliminate one. And 10,000 were eliminated overnight because the hospitality industry was in free fall. And what did that do? It both revived the industry, reactivated public spaces, which, told us we were still together, we were still there. It made the city come alive again. But I think it also showed us that we can adapt, we can change, and be much more nimble than I think we believe we can be, which was, to me, a very good sign.
Did writing the book change your view of the city at all?
I mean, it did, in the sense that I learned an enormous amount from talking to these people. It also gave me an enormous faith in the city, and reinforced the sense I have of the city as sort of humanity's greatest enterprise. The cosmopolitan idea is one of people coming together on equal footing and working out this project. A city is a shared project. It's a complication, but it's also a thing we do together. And I think the book just made me realize how beautiful that project is, how endless the city is. I mean, I'm a native New Yorker, and I, grew up thinking I knew the city. I moved away. I was based in Europe for a while. When I came back, I had the privilege of looking around neighborhoods I'd never been before. And I have to say, the city is a place that is endlessly surprising and inspiring. For all the troubles, there are communities everywhere which have done remarkable things in corners of the city that many people never get to see. It's hard for us to get out of our little, we think we do, but we really don't. There was a guy named Alex Garvin, I bet you remember.
Sure.
Alex goes back, he died sadly this year, but he goes back to the Lindsay administration. He grew up here, and he grew to love the city by making it a project every weekend to get out at another subway station and just walk around. And in a certain sense, the book was a kind of project like that for me too. It allowed me to look and think about things that you don't do in the ordinary course of life, and to discover just this incredible richness. I don't mean to sound like a promoter of the city, but it is.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, but it is such an inspiring thing, and I think especially during COVID, it was the thing that we all could see out our windows, and that we shared, and we would bang the pots out the window at 7 p.m. and that was a reminder that we were each there. And so is this history which we've shared and we add to, and which unfolded in talking to people. Your
windows growing up were in Greenwich Village,
yeah.
And you went up to the Upper West Side to take piano lessons. Now you've moved up there. You said to Bloomberg City Lab that it's interesting to come back to this neighborhood because you realize neighborhoods are things that are constantly evolving. They're made up by the collective idea that people have of each other at a given moment. How do you explain that?
I mean, I think healthy cities are always changing. That is a difficult thing. I think individually we grow to love things about, or at least we're used to, things in our neighborhood, and change can be scary. But in fact, cities, I think, are organisms. They benefit from change. You know, the word gentrification is often, a bad word in people's heads. In principle, gentrification is not necessarily bad. It means that wealth, maybe new businesses are coming to an area. What people really have in mind, I think, is displacement. Mm-hmm. And I think in New York, the thing that's happened is that the city has become so unaffordable to so many people. We've made it so difficult to build affordable housing that people equate change with displacement, the fear that they will no longer have what they have.
And then how do we reconcile the notion that we want more affordable housing, but more affordable housing presumably means more density in order to build affordable housing, which people don't want in their backyards?
You know, density is another word which we throw around, but I mean, density is I don't think people understand what density is even in New York. You know, the densest building I know in New York City is on 23rd Street and between 9th and 10th Avenues. It's a building built just before the Depression started. It was occupied originally by working people, now by very wealthy people. It's got a higher density per square foot than any other place in New York. It's also considered one of the most luxurious and pleasant places to live. It's not a high rise. I think density is equated somehow with a lack of services, that you're competing on the subway platforms for space and in schools and so forth. But I think, you know, there are a lot of areas of the city which could be denser.
Mm-hmm. Which building are you referring to there?
It's called Lincoln Terrace.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I mention it only because, you know, there was a concern, for instance, about some people equate, say, housing projects with density. They're some of the lowest density places in the city. They were originally built to have very low density. Mm-hmm. So what is it that we really don't want? Is it density? Because the neighborhoods that are often the most desirable and the buildings like that which are the most desirable are very high density? Or are we really talking about the fact that we don't want economic diversity in our neighborhoods? And I think that, you know, the Upper West Side, when I was growing up, was a much more diverse neighborhood. There was
economically diverse.
Economically diverse, also racially diverse, more so, but it still remains a diverse neighborhood. And in my area now, even though it's changed to become more affluent, you have public housing a block away. There's a residence for single mothers. Around the corner, there's a formerly homeless senior center. It's entirely integrated into this neighborhood. And I think the idea that somehow these new projects, new housing, increasing the population is somehow going to be a problem, especially in more affluent white neighborhoods, is a very dangerous thing.
Michael Kimmelman, the book is The Intimate City, Walking New York. And coming up next, my thoughts on decriminalizing corruption. Crime is creeping up in some places, and voters are rightfully unhappy. Last month, they took it out mostly on Democrats, who supported bail reform and decriminalization of marijuana and of so-called victimless and nonviolent offenses. Meanwhile, though, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court in Washington has been eviscerating legal protections against political corruption. The court has been deregulating white-collar crime by public officials. It has redefined honest graft in ways that would make a Tammany boss blush. It has, as Pat Moynihan would put it, defined politics as usual down to the level where it's legally, if not morally, acceptable to lie about their official duties, and for public officials to grant favors to people who have or are about to give them gifts, as long as prosecutors can't persuade a judge or jury that a pro connected the quid and the quo. The court said minor gifts don't count, nor do minor favors, nor are certain routine functions official acts. Conflicts of interest could be more or less tolerated too, because they're less serious than bribes or kickbacks. And last week, the court went a step further in questioning the case against a former aide to Governor Cuomo. Justices asked whether he could be prosecuted for depriving the government of honest services because he collected illicit payments during a hiatus when he was temporarily off the state payroll to run the governor's reelection campaign. For years, the court has been hacking away at the prosecutorial tools for combating bribery and corruption, said Zephyr Teachout, a Fordham law professor who ran for governor in 2014. That leaves average citizens dependent less on prosecutorial competence than on miscreants to make mistakes. Increasingly, she said, the court has made it really hard to bring cases against anyone but the most inept criminals. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.